Never go to the second location. Always trust your gut.
Hello, my name is Chrissy Champagne, and you are listening to Residue, a true crime podcast dedicated to keeping you paranoid. Today on Residue, we will be discussing the film Boys Don't Cry, the true story of Brandon Teena. You can follow Residue on Instagram at Residue Podcast, Facebook Residue, a true crime podcast, and TikTok Residue, a true crime podcast. I am so happy to welcome all of my new social media followers. Thank you so much. And as you know, the best thing you can possibly do is leave a positive review for any podcast that you love, because I know a lot of podcasters out there working their ass off by themselves, just like me. Thank you so much for all of the positive reviews. You guys, you don't understand. It means the world to me. And as always, listener discretion is advised. Before we begin, I just wanted to briefly touch on my experience reading Aphrodite Jones's book, All He Wanted, also the documentary, The Brandon Teena Story. Now, these were two of my absolute main sources for this episode. So while the book contains a lot of valuable information about Brandon Teena's life and the events surrounding his murder, I just found it to be a difficult read at times because of the way Brandon is portrayed. Throughout much of the book and the documentary, Brandon is referred to using female pronouns and is often described through the lens of his assigned sex at birth rather than the identity he lived and presented to the world. So, I understand this book was written in the 1990s, and this was when public understanding of transgender identities was very different from what it is today. But still, as I read, I often found myself frustrated by the repeated misgendering. And it could be jarring at times, felt like it overshadowed the person Brandon was trying to be. And as someone researching and telling his story, those moments were difficult to move past because they seem to conflict with the way Brandon consistently lived his life and how many people knew him. So, for that reason, I will be referring to Brandon using he, him pronouns throughout this entire episode. There will be no dead naming. My goal is to tell Brandon's story as respectfully as possible. Boys Don't Cry was released in 1999, directed by Kimberly Pierce, who also co-wrote the screenplay with Andy Bienen. And Kimberly Pierce spent years researching the case and interviewing people connected to Brandon Teena's life before making this film. Kimberly said that she wanted audiences to see Brandon as a person with hopes, relationships, and dreams, not just as the victim of a crime. The film stars Hilary Swank as Brandon Teena, and this performance earned her the Academy Award for Best Actress. Chloe Sevigny stars as Lana Tisdale and received an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actress. And I just have to note right here, I Googled how to say Chloe Sevigny's name because I got ripped to shreds on TikTok for saying it wrong. I called her something completely different because I always thought you pronounced it Chloe Sevigny. And I understand now that I was very wrong. So just let me know if I said it right this time. I went to Google. I did a pronunciation. I looked it up. He said, you say Chloe Sevigny. The film also stars Peter Sarsgaard as John Lauder and Brandon Sexton as Tim Neeson. Leslie Goranson of Roseanne fame, Becky, she also stars in this film. Now, her character's name is Candace, but this is actually portrayal of Lisa Lambert in the true story. This film is absolutely fantastic. I'm telling you, the acting is mind-blowing. It's the kind of film you don't want to watch twice. It's a very difficult watch. The entire time I'm reading the book, All He Wanted by Aphrodite Jones, I can only picture Hilary Swank as Brandon Teena. She did a phenomenal job. Roger Ebert awarded Boys Don't Cry a perfect 4 out of 4 stars. He said he was deeply moved by the cast's ability to ground the movie in authentic, real-world struggles without sentimentalizing them. And he highlighted that Hilary Swank was a wake-up call, pointing out how effortlessly and energetically she radiated the excitement and naivety of a man exploring his own identity. And Chloe Sevigny, he described her portrayal of Lana as a revelation. I have to point out right in the beginning of our episode here that while Boys Don't Cry introduced millions to Brandon Teena's story, some critics argue that the film left out key people and details, including one victim whose absence continues to spark discussion decades later. One of the biggest criticisms of Boys Don't Cry is what it leaves out. Because on the night that Brandon Teena was killed, 2 other people were also murdered, Lisa Lambert and Philip Devine. And while Lisa appears in the film, Leslie Goranson playing Candace, who is supposed to be a representation of Lisa, Philip Devine, a black man who was dating Lana Tisdale's sister Leslie, was omitted entirely from the film. Now, Philip's omission from this film has become the subject of discussions about race, whose stories get told in true crime, and LGBTQ plus history. And some people argue that remembering Philip does not take away from Brandon's story. Instead, it gives a fuller picture of what happened that night, and it honors all 3 victims. So we will be discussing more about Philip and Lisa as we go along in this episode. I do want to point out that my sources are always listed in the show notes, and I listened to this fantastic 10-minute podcast episode. The name of the podcast was called Erased. I'm not sure she's making any newer episodes. It seems the last episode was in January, but she does a 10-minute episode on Philip Devine. And as I said earlier, my 2 main sources for today were Aphrodite Jones's All He Wanted and the documentary, which was fantastic, titled The Brandon Teena Story. A poem by Brandon Teena. Changes I'm going through in my life will change me forever. Soon I'll have anybody I want and give them the love I have. I'm not as strong as I thought and can't fight. I don't think I can make it alone. To understand Brandon Teena's story, it's very important to start with his mother, Joanne Brandon. Now, Joanne married very young. She was only 16 years old and 1 month pregnant with Brandon when her husband, Pat Brandon, was killed in an automobile accident. On December 12th, 1972, Brandon Teena was born in Lincoln, Nebraska. And at the time, Joanne was already raising a young daughter, Tammy. Following Patrick's death, Joanne and her children moved back in with her mother. Joanne had this deep distrust of men, and this was shaped by painful experiences from her own childhood. When Joanne was only 6 years old, her father abandoned the family, and he abandoned the family for their 19-year-old babysitter. And for Joanne, this was absolutely beyond devastating. She learned about betrayal. It helped shape her belief that men could not be trusted. After the death of her husband, who was the love of her life, Joanne clung to Brandon. He was the final product of her love for her husband, Patrick. And Brandon was a really good baby, but he was always sick. Joanne would say that Tammy was her healthy child and Brandon was her sick child. Brandon grew up never knowing his father, and his sister Tammy barely remembered him. She was just a toddler when he died. But growing up with no father figure, there were always Joanne's brothers, Alan, Billy, and Michael, and they helped out as much as they could. By the time Brandon was a toddler, Joanne got remarried. And the second that Brandon laid eyes on Joanne's new boyfriend, he adored him. And this is partly the reason that Joanne agreed to marry Jug. They met in September, and by middle of September, Jug already asked Joanne to marry him. But Joanne wasn't in love with him. She felt pressured to marry him. They had a simple ceremony at the courthouse, and when Joanne was asked to say "I do," she paused for so long that Jug's dad stood up and said, "Please, Joanne, just say yes." Jug was the only father that Brandon ever knew. And Tammy was able to remember her father a little bit, but both girls called Jug Dad. Brandon and his sister Tammy were exact opposites. Brandon was more of a tomboy, says his sister. He didn't like playing with dolls. He didn't like playing house. Tammy remembers that Brandon would never wear dresses, and their mom, Joanne, forced him to. Brandon and his sister attended St. Mary's Elementary School and Pius X High School in Lincoln, Nebraska. And here is where Brandon is remembered as socially awkward. Brandon's sister Tammy recalls to Aphrodite Jones, "The church that we attended was really significant to Brandon. We went to Catholic school, and I think they kind of brainwash you in kindergarten on being priests and nuns. They always bring in priests and nuns to talk to you about how they got the calling and how you'll know if you have the calling." Now, Brandon never wanted to be a nun. He always wanted to be a priest, and I thought it was funny because I had to participate in these masses that Brandon would play. Instead of playing house, Brandon liked to pretend he was a priest. Now, Tammy recalls to the author that Brandon would tell her, "I'm going to be a priest when I grow up," and it never really struck Tammy that Brandon should have been saying he wanted to be a nun. Joanne and Jug were wed in 1974, and they were divorced by 1980. They didn't have any children together, and Joanne wanted it that way. They remained friends after the divorce, even getting along better than they did in the marriage. According to Joanne, Tammy and Brandon had been collecting Social Security since their dad's death, and that is what the three of them lived on after she and Jug sold their house, got divorced. Brandon was devastated after the divorce because it happened at the same time he found out that Jug wasn't his real father. Joanne told her lawyer that she wanted Jug to have visitation, and her lawyer was like, "Listen, if you want this guy to have visitation, then he should pay you child support." But Jug said, "No way. I'm not doing it. Forget it. I don't need to see the girls." And Joanne knew the girls really loved him, so she was only thinking about her kids, and she felt like they needed to maintain a good relationship with Jug, so he was allowed to see them every other weekend. And for a while, things were great. The kids would go there every other weekend. That is until Jug met a woman named Debbie. Now, Debbie was this strict conservative. She was the opposite of Joanne. And with Debbie, things were really tough when the kids visited. It wasn't the same. Debbie was rough on those kids. Brandon started having nightmares, and once Joanne found out that her child is having nightmares about this woman, she gave Jug an ultimatum, and Jug chose Debbie. At this point, Brandon was 12 years old, a fantastic student, even winning an award called the Best of the Bunch Award. Joanne instilled a great work ethic into her kids, taught them about finances early, taught them right from wrong. And around the age of 12 was when Brandon met the person who would become one of his closest friends, even closer than a best friend, a sister, Sarah Gapp. At the time, Sarah Gapp attended St. Teresa School while Brandon was going to a different school, but the two connected almost immediately. They met at a basketball game and ended up sitting together outside of this game, talking late into the evening. And what started as this casual conversation, it quickly became much deeper, with Sarah opening up about her very difficult home life and describing her mother as abusive, explaining how poorly she was treated. Brandon listened, and the two quickly formed this bond. From that night on, their friendship grew even stronger. Both were dealing with challenges in their personal lives, and they found comfort in having someone who understood what it felt like to struggle. Sarah confided in Brandon that her house was, quote, a psycho house, that her mother abused her, that she was being abused sexually by family members, and she said that Brandon listened to all of this. Brandon was a great listener, and he always knew the right moment to speak. Brandon sat there and listened to Sarah talk about these horrific things that were going on in her home. And then Brandon confided in Sarah that he had some issues in his own family. Sarah told Aphrodite Jones that Brandon told me that one of his relatives was doing something to him that he didn't like. It later came out that as young children, both Brandon and Tammy were sexually abused by one of their family members for many years. Brandon now has a best friend, someone to confide in, and both teenagers end up in the same high school, Pius X. Brandon hated this school. He was always playing pranks and, quote, always running around like a maniac and mocking this school any chance he could get. Dress code was strict. Girls had to wear skirts that touched the top of their knees. It was a very preppy school filled with lots of khaki. Brandon didn't conform, but instead of wearing a skirt, he wore slacks with a tie, and technically he couldn't get in trouble for that. During his sophomore year, Brandon got a part-time job at McDonald's and hated it. But he always worked hard. By this time, Joanne had a new boyfriend named Mike. And sister Tammy moved out of the home. She moved across town with a boyfriend that was horrible to her, everyone says in this book, All He Wanted. Brandon at this time was making enough money to save up and move out of this house and move in with a friend named Tracy Beals. Now, Tracy was a year ahead of Brandon and, quote, led Brandon around by the nose. According to friends, Tracy kept Brandon all to herself. She was very abusive and she was very possessive of Brandon. And around this time is when Brandon really started to change and realizing that he isn't like his peers. His inner feelings made him think he had something wrong with him, but couldn't fix it, writes Aphrodite Jones. Brandon had a very abusive relationship with Tracy. Everyone knew them as friends, but Sarah noticed a ton of hickeys on Brandon's neck one day. She's like, what is going on? He's telling her that Tracy holds him down and puts hickeys on his neck. She sometimes slaps him, punches him. Nobody wanted to see Brandon in this home anymore with Tracy. So Brandon moves back in with his sister Tammy. And Tammy is the first one that notices that Brandon is acting a little different. Skipping school, not a good student anymore. Things start going missing in Tammy's house. Money goes missing. And it got to the point where she soon wanted Brandon out of her house now. And he moved back in with his mom. So Brandon starts feeling like he really doesn't belong anywhere. And he just longs for a path forward. Starts to become excited about enlisting in the Army, but is devastated to learn he failed the written entrance exam. So Brandon becomes depressed with no direction, and no one can read him, not even his best friend Sarah. And at this point, Sarah finds out she is pregnant, and she starts to get serious with this new guy named Drew. So Brandon is feeling even more and more distant from everyone around him, just completely alone. In late December 1990, Brandon received a phone call, and the Billy identity began. The Billy identity started in December of 1990. Now, Brandon gets this phone call. He answers the phone. It's a very young girl, Liz Delano. She's about 13 years old. She thinks she's calling someone else. She calls the wrong number. But her and Brandon start flirting with each other, and Brandon tells her his name is Billy Brinson. This girl, Liz, wants to meet up with Brandon, who at this point is about 17 or 18 years old. And he tells Sarah and Sarah's boyfriend Drew about this he called a, quote, prank. So he was like, hey, listen, I'm going to go meet up with this girl and she thinks I'm a guy. So you guys keep this a secret. And he met up with this young girl pretending to be Billy Brinson. Through this young girl, Liz, Brandon meets her best friend named Heather. Now, Brandon and Heather start to date. And then eventually, Brandon moves in with Heather. They think his name is Billy Brinson. Now, Joanne is pissed that her child, even though now Brandon is 18 and living at this girl's house, Joanne is pissed that her child is, quote, Joanne's words, passing himself off as a boy. She would call Heather's house. Now, Heather had a mother named Ruth. She would call this house and harass them, leaving all of these menacing voicemails on the machine. By mid-1991 now, Brandon is officially dating Heather, and Heather states, quote, he was like everybody's dream guy. He knew how a woman wanted to be treated. 3 months after they started dating, Brandon bought Heather a promise ring. Heather stated, he treated me like I was somebody, like I was important. He let you know in so many ways that he cared without pressuring you for sex. The subject of sex came up maybe once in a while. All my friends thought we were having sex, and I was like, no, we haven't. They thought we were lying because we shared a bed together. I was like, yes, that's all we do. We close our eyes and we sleep, we cuddle. That's it. So at this point, Brandon's mom is harassing Heather, her mother, Brandon. Now they believe that Brandon is a boy. And so Joanne, Brandon's mother, is calling the house and leaving voicemails telling them, no, Brandon was born a female. So of course, Heather has questions about this. And Heather is questioning also why they never are intimate. Brandon tells Heather that he was born a hermaphrodite and his mother had to choose which sex he would become. Heather didn't even know what this term meant. She said she went to the library, she looked it up. She was fine with all of this. And soon, Brandon proposes to Heather and she says yes. And she wants to be with Brandon fully, as the book would say. But Brandon says, no, we should not be intimate. We should not be, quote, fully together. We should wait for that. We should wait for our wedding day. But at this point, Joanne and Tammy are freaking out about what is going on with Brandon. And Sarah is also getting upset because her best friend, Brandon, is showering this girl, Heather, with gifts that Sarah knows Brandon cannot afford. And Sarah feels like Heather is taking advantage of Brandon. I mean, she's super young. She's taking in all these gifts. I mean, he was working part-time jobs. He couldn't afford the type of gifts that he was buying Heather. So it ends up that Joanne confronts Heather. But Heather already heard the story about what happened to Brandon at birth. So she's telling Joanne, listen, I'm fine with the way Brandon is. And Joanne is completely confused because she knows that the story that Brandon is telling Heather is a lie. So Sarah and Drew, Sarah's boyfriend, are keeping Brandon's secret. They feel indebted to him since he helped them get back together. But other people in town, they're talking. And male acquaintances of Drew would make comments behind Brandon's back, such as, if she wants to be a man, she better, well, fight like one. Now, all of these rumors are swirling, but those aren't the only rumors, because Brandon was also stealing. Brandon stole a man's checkbook, forged his signature to buy random items like clothes, shoes, cassette tapes, but then he got a hold of Heather's mom's checkbook and debit card. Now, Heather's mom, Ruth, had checks bouncing all over the place, and so she reported it to Lancaster County. Everything seems to be spiraling out of control. Brandon is stealing, taking money from the people that he's living with, and Heather doesn't want to deal with it anymore. Heather breaks up with Brandon, tells him, we are done, and Brandon swallows an entire bottle of antibiotics. Sarah gets a phone call saying that Brandon needs help. So in January of 1992, Brandon underwent a psychiatric evaluation which concluded that he had a severe, quote, sexual identity crisis, and he was later taken to the Lancaster County Crisis Center to ensure that he was not suicidal. Brandon was released from the center 3 days later and began attending therapy sessions, sometimes accompanied by his mother or his sister. But during these sessions, he was reluctant to discuss his sexuality. He did reveal that he had been raped, but would not give any details. He denied needing therapy. He denied having any family problems. He denied any troubles. And a therapist told Joanne that Brandon needed a sex change, and Joanne believed this to be, quote, bogus. She said the only thing she knew about sex changes was what she saw on TV, daytime TV talk shows. I'm going to read a quote from Joanne in the book, All He Wanted, but I am going to change the pronouns that Joanne uses. Brandon said that he felt more like a man inside than a woman, and I didn't know what to say. You have to realize how devastated I was. I raised this child for 18 years and never had a clue there was anything different going on in his life. These therapy sessions ended after only 2 weeks, and Brandon meets a new girl, Brianna, age 15. At this point, Brandon was 19. Rihanna says of Brandon, he was so cute, he was gorgeous. Anyone who laid eyes on him, they're like, that's what I want, that is Mr. Right. Joanne, of course, called Rihanna's mom, Brenda, and asked to speak with her. Now, Brenda and Joanne went to high school together. Brenda knew all about Brandon, so Joanne told them more about Brandon and showed them his birth certificate that read female, and she told them, I will not play Brandon's game. So this broke up Brandon and Rihanna, but they remained very close friends. I know I'm throwing a lot of names at you here, but we got one more girl to talk about. Her name is Gina Bartu. She was 19 years old from a middle-class family. Brandon and Gina start dating, and at this time, Brandon is living with his grandmother, and he was intensely in love with this girl, Gina. Eventually, Brandon, Gina, Rihanna, and another guy named Alan move in together. Aphrodite Jones writes, the four of them shared a place at Cheney Trailer Park over on 27th Street. They were a 90s kind of family, everybody vaguely connected, held together by need rather than blood, just trying to make ends meet. By 1993, Brandon was charged with 18 counts of theft and forgery. This was getting crazy, insane. Gina had enough of it. She didn't want to be a part of this. So Gina ended up getting her own apartment, and Brandon was always back in her life. It was a cycle with these two. He would come back into her life, buying her gifts nonstop, but Gina felt stuck. This relationship was not enough for her. She wanted out. And in one last-ditch effort, Brandon charged a diamond ring for Gina and asked her to marry him. But on September 3rd, 1993, Gina received a call from the Lancaster County Jail. Brandon was picked up again for forgery, and Gina agreed to bail him out. She posted $150, but she wasn't happy about doing this. She soon received in the mail a $454 bill from Montgomery Ward. This was a store in the mall. So she called the store to find out what this bill was for. And guess what they tell her? A diamond engagement ring was charged on Gina's own credit card. So like I said, by 1993, Brandon is already charged with 18 counts of theft and forgery, and most people in town figured out the truth. Like I said, Brandon was getting taunted, harassed, threatened. I mean, he's still madly in love with Gina, but he starts dating another girl named Daphne. Now, Daphne says, I guess I was just somebody to fall back on because Brandon and Gina were always breaking up. And as you can tell from all of the names that I've thrown at you, things are getting pretty rough for Brandon in Lincoln, Nebraska. And in 1993, after facing so many legal troubles in Lincoln, Brandon moved, left town, and relocated to Falls City, Nebraska in Richardson County. And there, he continued living as a man and quickly became well-liked among many of the local young people. I mean, Brandon was handsome, outgoing, charismatic. He had this easy way of making friends. I mean, Brandon was feeling the heat back in Lincoln, Nebraska, but in the 1990s, Falls City, Nebraska was a small, tight-knit, predominantly white rural community, and it was deeply socially conservative with pervasive traditional views on gender and sexuality. It was a hostile and unsafe environment for LGBTQ plus individuals. The town was overwhelmingly white and lacking racial diversity. When Brandon moves to Falls City, he meets a girl named Lisa Lambert. Now, Lisa Lambert was a beautiful 24-year-old who really felt like she was finally becoming the best version of herself. She was described as having beautiful long hair and strikingly exquisite turquoise eyes. She was a single mom of 7-month-old baby boy Tanner. and Lisa rented this house she was living at for about $125 a month. So she figured she could afford to be gracious and be a host and let her friends crash there. And then she meets Brandon, and she really liked Brandon. Like, Lisa really gravitated towards Brandon because he was so great with her son. And, of course, she thought Brandon was extremely attractive and cute. But she definitely felt like he looked a little too young for her. Lisa was a nursing assistant at the Colonial Acres nursing home, and coworkers were getting a little nervous for Lisa at this point in time because she seemed unwell. She was always getting really sick. She only weighed about 95 pounds. Her mother, Anna Mae Lambert, was always giving Lisa a hard time, especially about her son being a, quote, illegitimate child. Now, Brandon and Lisa dated briefly, but things ended really quickly. Brandon was the new popular guy in town. Girls were falling for Brandon, and very soon he starts dating Lana Tisdale. She was a 19-year-old friend of Lisa Lambert's, and Lisa was livid when they started dating, even calling Lana and telling her Brandon was using her. And Brandon was smitten with Lana from the start. Brandon was not using Lana. He walked into a local karaoke bar one night. He saw Lana singing the song The Bluest Eyes in Texas. And this was an instant connection. It is head over heels time for these two, and when Lana Tisdale speaks to the documentary crew of the Brandon Teena story, she says that Brandon loved Cher. He thought she was the most gorgeous woman that ever existed, and he would sit around with Lana and talk about cars, and she says it felt nice, finally being treated like a lady for once. She said this felt different. At this point, Brandon is a wanted felon. Brandon is not appearing for his court dates. Things are getting very complicated. To make things even more complicated, Alana introduces Brandon to her friends, John Lauder, Tom Neeson. Now, John used to date Lana. When Lana was about 12 or 13 years old, John Lauder had a crush on her. He's about a year older than Brandon. He was always seeing her at his house because Lana was best friends with John Lauder's little sister, Michelle. So Lana was always around their house. And as they grow older, Lana and John start dating. And it doesn't last very long. And Lana swears that they never went any farther than just kissing. So John's a criminal. He's in and out of jail constantly, and while he's in jail, he's always writing Lana letters telling her that he loves her, they're going to be married. But John was also a very jealous guy. Didn't want Lana talking to nobody. But of course, he was allowed to do whatever he wanted, and he constantly cheated. So they break up, but they remain good friends. And now Brandon is becoming friends with John Lauder. Brandon gets arrested. He is placed in jail. He has nobody to call. Nobody wants to help him. But Lana says she will help him. Now, he needs to be bailed out. Lana has no money, but that day, her father gave her a blank check with his signature on it to go get her hair cut. And she used that blank check to bail Brandon out of jail. But Lana was underage, so she asked her friend Tom Neeson to bail Brandon out for her. Tom Neeson was born Marvin Tom Neeson, and as a child, Tom was small, and his father would hit him for any little mistake he made. He is also described as slow. Tom was married to a woman named Candy, and he cheated on her nonstop, like crazy, even getting one of her friends pregnant. So here's just a snippet example, because I don't want to talk too much about this guy, but this woman claimed that Tom got her pregnant. Candy, Tom's wife, finds out while she's cooking a steak. She throws the frying pan at Tom's head. He takes off his wedding ring, throws it at Candy's head. It bounces off her head, and he laughs at her. And then he leaves the house. But of course, he comes back days later, and they're back together. So this is what these two did nonstop, on and off. The man was constantly cheating on his wife. And believe me, I have no idea how. But that is enough about him. Okay, so just to set the scene here, in this tiny-ass town, Tom is another guy that has a huge-ass crush on Lana. And of course, Tom's wife doesn't like this. He is not supposed to be hanging out with Lana, but Tom helps Lana bail her boyfriend out of jail, and in turn, Tom is now hanging out with Lana, Brandon, and John Lauder all of the time. And his wife does not like this. So December 19th, 1993, Brandon was arrested for forging checks and Lana bailed him out of jail using her father's money and the help of Tom Neeson. But because Brandon was placed in the female section of the jail, Lana learns about Brandon's lies. But Lana's already deep in it. She really cares for Brandon. She really has some deep feelings. And now we're in a moment where this whole little tiny town is finding out about Brandon and that he lied. And in their minds, they're saying that he tricked them. They talk about this a lot in the documentary, The Brandon Teena Story, thinking that Brandon came into our town and he tricked us and we don't want him here. The nonchalantness of all of the people that are interviewed in this documentary is absolutely disgusting. The laughing, the smirking. Just watch it for yourselves and you will see. And I will tell you, proceed with caution. It's a very well done documentary. It's very, very well done. But the thing is that I could only get about part way through, and it's a very short documentary, only about 49 minutes long. I got part way through to the part about the sheriff, which we are about to talk about in a couple minutes. And I had to turn that off and come back the next day because being witness to these interviews of these people and just the way they speak about Brandon, it's a little bit unbelievable. So for a while, Brandon managed to carve out a place for himself in Fall City. But once the truth about his identity began circulating through town, everything changed. On Christmas Eve 1993, there is a party at Tom Neeson's house. Everyone is drinking extremely heavily. Tom is pushing Brandon's buttons all night long. And Tom wants to start a fight with Brandon. He's physically pushing him, punching him, telling him he wants to take his pants off so that they can, quote, see what he had down there. And they force Brandon to go into the bathroom with them. Now, this next part is in Brandon's words. Brandon was interviewed by Sheriff Lau, and he stated that Tom looked at me and said, "John and I need to talk to you." I said, "Okay," and we walked into the bathroom, and John turned around and held the door, and Tom hit me once, and I fell in the tub, and he stood back up and hit me again. This time, I fell back on the floor, and he kicked me in the ribs, and I don't know how many times. He stepped on my back, then he picked me up by my coat and carried me out to the car by my coat. I got in the back seat. That is when I knew something was going to happen. And I asked why. I did beg with them. I did plead. Tom told me, "Are you going to make this easy or are you going to make this hard?" And then he goes, in fact, he said that either way, you can have the shit beat out of you and then have it happen anyway. After Tom and John assaulted Brandon in the bathroom, they forced him into a car and drove to a meatpacking plant in Richardson County, where they assaulted and gang raped Brandon. They take Brandon back to Tom's house where they were originally, and they order Brandon to take a shower. But Brandon escapes from a bathroom window and runs to Lana's house. Once he's at Lana's home, he speaks to Lana's mother, Linda, and Linda tells him, "Listen, nobody deserves this. You should not stay silent. You must report this, Brandon. You have to go to the police." The interview with Sheriff Lau is disgusting. It's absolutely horrid. It is the one reason I had to stop the documentary. They have the actual tapes, and you can find that documentary on Prime right now. This man, an authority figure, who's supposed to protect people, is listening to Brandon tell his story of being gang raped. And this man is the most vile human being. Brandon explains to him that he was raped. And this sheriff responds, "So when they got ready to poke you, how was you positioned in the back seat?" Okay, I'm going to stop there. I have the entire interview in front of me. I'm not going to read it. It's worse than you can imagine. You can look it up in that documentary, like I told you, but you get the point. Brandon's not feeling safe in this moment. And he's starting to feel like, where is he ever going to feel safe at this point? So, like I said, in the documentary, The Brandon Teena Story, you can see this entire interview, but you can also see interviews with John Lauder, Tom Neeson, and I'm telling you right now, get ready to punch your TV right off of your mantle or wherever you have it sitting, because these are some of the most disgusting interviews you will ever see. And I think I've said the word disgusting like 17 times now. I don't know. It's almost like I'm blanking on a word to use for how these people behave. These people are talking about raping Brandon, and they're laughing. They're smirking. They're making jokes. John Latter, sitting in prison, tells the documentary crew, I couldn't really finish because I was thinking about my fiance too much, and laughs about it. After this interview, Brandon goes to stay with his friend, Lisa Lambert. He feels safe there. And at this point, Tom and John are coming around Lana's house, and Lana's mother, Linda, confronts them and says, "What did you do to Brandon?" And of course, they're denying it. They're like, "We didn't do anything. What are you talking about?" She tells them, "Well, listen, if you did do something, I would go and get rid of the evidence because I told Brandon to go to the police and he reported it." She admits on film that she told them to get rid of the evidence. The police call Tom and John in for questioning on December 28th, and Tom denies any involvement at all, but tells police that, yeah, John was the one that sexually assaulted, that raped Brandon. And John says, "No, I didn't." And they just let them leave. They were allowed to go home. Brandon's staying with Lisa. They ask everyone where Brandon is, and Lana tells them he's with Lisa. So around 1 a.m. on December 31st, 1993, John and Tom drive to Lisa Lambert's house, and they break in. And they find Lisa in bed, and they just want to know where Brandon is. They're just yelling at her, and Lisa's refusing to tell them. Mind you, Lisa has a 7-month-old son in the house. It's not just Brandon there. She also has her friend, Philip Devine. Now, Philip Devine was dating Leslie Tisdale, Lana's sister. And at the time, Philip was in a fight with Leslie and decided he should go stay at Lisa's house for the night. Lisa Lambert and Philip Devine get completely lost in this story. But like I said in the beginning, Philip Devine is erased from the film. In my show notes, you can find an article titled "The Meaning of the Deletion of the Black Victim in Boys Don't Cry." Now, this is a paper written from the Asian Conference on Arts and Humanities 2024 official conference proceedings. Miho Mori at Suma Women's University, Japan. This article gives a lot more insight into Philip Devine's life, and it states that in 1997, John Gregory Dunn was a reporter for The New Yorker, noting that Philip Devine was physically handicapped with only a stump for a right leg, a prosthetic device that attached below the knee. Philip's physical disabilities at birth specifically included the following. Philip Devine's life was not without hardship of its own. Because of a defective prescription drug that his mother had been taking during pregnancy, he was born 2 months premature with a damaged heart, crossed eyes, lungs that were permanently scarred, and a right leg that ended at the knee. In spite of his physical torment, he had grown into a strapping youth, so agile on his prosthetic leg that he was able to compete vigorously in sandlot sports. Furthermore, according to Aphrodite Jones, who did extensive research on Brandon Teena and was the first to publish a book on this case, Philip's mother, Phyllis, was a devotee of transcendental meditation and would sometimes leave Philip and his brother behind while she went to these meetings. Eventually, Phyllis and her husband Paul divorced and each remarried. Philip and his brother were taken in by his father, and Aphrodite Jones describes Philip thereafter as follows. In 1984, Philip moved to Maryland with his dad. Paul had gotten divorced again and was starting life over, having decided it was best to live near his sister. Now, his sister had become a successful entrepreneur in leasing and selling computers, and Paul needed her to help raise Philip. And as it turned out, his sister was a tremendous force in Philip's life. She was able to give Philip a strong sense of self, and Philip was given an education and a stable life by his aunt. But when he got tired of living with her in Maryland, he contacted his mother and lived with her in California for a while. He also got tired of that too and decided to go to Job Corps in Denison, Iowa. And what can be said about Philip up to this point is that despite his mother's excessive devotion to religion, his parents' divorce, and his physical disability, he managed to live a life on his own without committing a crime. The reason why Philip's life started to go out of order was when he met Leslie Tisdale, the sister of Lana Tisdale, the girlfriend of Brandon Teena, the main character in Boys Don't Cry. The following description by Aphrodite Jones indicates that Philip had a full life in Job Corps and was well liked by those around him. Quote, Philip was a leader. He was an outstanding, charismatic student. He was the kind of student that other students liked to emulate because he had those leadership qualities. People were just drawn to him. He had the attention of adults, which was unusual for a young man. It was almost like he was destined to become so much more in his life. And not only was Philip a smart kid, but he was a smart dresser and he was a good-looking guy. He was loved by those around him. Now, as I said, that was just a tiny bit of this fantastic article that I do have linked in the show notes. I just wanted to be able to give you a little more background or a feeling for what Philip was like, because we learn so much about Brandon. We learned more about Lisa, but they completely omitted Philip from the film. Now, Tom and John are begging Lisa to tell them where Brandon is, if anyone else is in the home. And she does tell them that Philip Devine is in the home. It's at this point that the men notice that Brandon is hiding under a blanket at the foot of the bed. And did they shoot Brandon in the stomach? Now, Tom will later testify that he noticed Brandon wasn't dead. Brandon was twitching. So he asked John for the knife. Tom said, I asked John for the knife to make sure that he was dead. I took the knife out of John's hand, grabbed Brandon, and stabbed him. Lisa Lambert was shot in the stomach, and after they left her in that room to find Philip, they returned with Philip. They then shoot Lisa a second time in the eye. And then they take Philip into a living room, sit him on the couch, and they shoot him twice. They run from the house and they throw their weapon and gloves onto a frozen river. And then they returned to Falls City because if you remember, Lisa lived in Humboldt, Nebraska. On December 31st, 1993, Ann May Lambert, Lisa's mom, she's arriving to her daughter's house to babysit her grandchild. It's about 8 a.m. She's banging on the door. No one's answering the door, but she can hear her grandson Tanner crying. So she just walks right in. She says, this woman, the way that she says this to the documentary crew, she is so calm. Like, this is insane to me. And what she says is absolutely insane to me. She says, at first, I denied anything was wrong. I just seen this N-word laying on the floor with a coffee table over his lap, and I thought, well, that's strange. And I knew something was wrong. But I just tell myself, no. There wasn't. So I walked through the house. I walked straight to the baby's crib. I could see my daughter laying in her bedroom, and I knew there was nothing I could do to help Lisa. I just needed to get help there to help my grandson. Tom and John are arrested, and Tom's trial begins in February of 1995. And Tom says, yes, we carried out these murders so that Brandon couldn't testify against us that we raped him. And I believe that had I not met Brandon and John Lauder, I'd be in no mess at all. The prosecution tells the jury that these are calculated executions. Lisa was shot in the stomach first. The gun was pointed directly in Lisa's eye. Philip Devine had a bullet to the head. And Tom Neeson is found guilty right away. Then John Lauder trial begins. And the state's evidence against Lauder, it was weak. So they go to Tom and they offer him a plea deal for his testimony against John. And Tom gets on the stand and tells everyone that John is the only one that shot. John is the one that used the gun. John shot everyone. And the jury finds John guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Brandon Teena, and then second-degree murder for Lisa Lambert and Philip Devine. And John Lauder is sentenced to death row. Sheriff Charles Lowe lost his bid for re-election, but he was elected to county commissioner. And Joanne Brandon filed a wrongful death suit against the former Sheriff Lowe and against Richardson County. She won the case. This case was heard in September 1999, and she was awarded $80,000. And another little tidbit is that Lana Tisdale sued the film producers of Boys Don't Cry for the unauthorized use of her name and likeness before the film's release. She did not like the fact that the film portrayed her as this, quote, lazy, white trash, skanky snake. And she also claimed that the film falsely portrayed that she continued her relationship with Brandon after discovering that Brandon was not really a man. She did win this lawsuit, but the settlement was undisclosed. Now, I do have to note that Brandon's mother, Joanne, really objected to the media referring to her child as he and Brandon. And when Hilary Swank gave her acceptance speech, Hilary thanked Brandon Teena, referring to him as a man, and Joanne Brandon said that this really set her off. She didn't like that Hilary, quote, stood up there and thanked my child. I get tired of people taking credit for what they don't know. But I do have to say, Joanne did start to come around in 2013. She spoke with a reporter, and although she did still use the wrong pronouns and did dead name Brandon, she spoke about how she was really unhappy with the movie Boys Don't Cry. She didn't like how they depicted the situation involving her child, but she did say about the film, it did give gay and transgender advocates a platform to voice their opinions, and I am glad of that. There were a lot of people who didn't understand what it was Brandon was going through. We've come a long way. Joanne reflected in this interview and thought, I wonder how my life would be different if he were still here with me. He would be such a joy to have around. He was always such a happy kid. I imagine him being a happy adult. Brandon, living as a man. Thank you so much for joining me here today on Residue. Residue is created, hosted, written, researched, edited, produced by me, Chrissy Champagne. You know I love you guys so much. Resi Crew forever. And until next Tuesday, stay safe and stay paranoid. Stay paranoid.